So I'm Tina Jackson, Director of the Community Independence Project, or the Project, or CIP for short. And with me are some of our wonderful team, Kathy McGowan, Alana Johnson, Liz Miglerini, Anjo Geddes, and Michelle Gunscombe. So on behalf of the team, welcome, and a very special welcome and thank you to our panel tonight, Julianne Schulz and Mary Crooks, who will be in conversation with Alana Johnson. And we'd also like to give heartfelt thanks to everyone who gave a donation when they bought their tickets. This helps us cover our costs and is really deeply appreciated. So thank you for that. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging country and paying my respects to the traditional owners, past, present, and emerging. And in doing so, we acknowledge the immense sorrow that was created when they were separated from their land and their culture, sorrow that still permeates through the generations. We express our hope for healing and commit ourselves to learning from our Indigenous peoples and working together towards genuine reconciliation. Today is National Apology Day, which remembers the national apology to the stolen generations by Kevin Rudd on the 13th of February, 15 years ago. It was the first formal public apology for the forcible renewal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families and the deep and ongoing intergenerational trauma this caused. So I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of the Camaragal people. So please let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from. Later this year, we'll all be asked to vote in the First Nations Voice to Parliament referendum. So we couldn't think of a more timely and a more important topic to launch the year's Zoom program. The referendum marks a crucial moment in our nation's history, and it will be carried by what non-Indigenous Australians say and do. And it is this responsibility of non-Indigenous citizens that is our focus tonight. CIP's vision is to put community at the centre of politics for a greener, caring, equitable and prosperous Australia. So this evening we'll explore putting community at the centre of this pivotal nation-building moment in our history. We'll ask, how can communities support the yes vote? And how can communities ensure their MPs and Senators represent them? We'll talk about community building and what this means, the courageous conversations we need to have about colonisation, harm and injustice, and the important role of First Nations people and culture in Australian identity. Over the coming months, if we succeed in this community engagement, if we come together on the journey to reconciliation, at the end, we will have a stronger community rather than a nation divided. In the words of the statement from the heart, history is calling us. So we'll introduce tonight's conversation by playing the short video, History is Calling. Michelle, can you play that for us?
I got a story to tell you. It's a good one. It's about how these people, the first people, got a voice.
60,000 years they've been speaking.
Had 363 languages.
But no voice. No say on matters which affected them. It wasn't right.
So, me and your granddad.
Me and your mum.
The whole nation did something about it. People called their friends and families. People talked about it on the streets, talked about it at work, on the field. Everybody made a song and dance about it.
Everyone walked side by side.
And that's how we changed this country for the better. How we made history.
Is that story true?
It could be.
Authorised by the Uluru Dialogue Sydney.
So tonight is about how together we will make that story happen. So on that note, I'll hand over to Alana, who, as well as being a director of CIP, is co-founder and past president of Voices for Indi, and she's convener of the Victorian Women's Trust and a renowned facilitator of conversations, amongst many other things. So please put your questions to the panel in the chat, and the team will be monitoring these, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. So Alana, over to you.
Thanks so much, Tina. Wonderful to be here. Hello, everybody out there across the nation. So I'm coming to you from Tangarong country, which is in northeast Victoria, and it's my great pleasure to be with you tonight and to introduce our two special guests. So firstly, we have Professor Julianne Schulz. Julianne is an Australian academic, media manager, author and editor. She's the founding editor of the Australian Literary and Current Affairs journal, The Griffith Review, and is currently a professor at Griffith University Centre for Social and Cultural Research. She's the author of an extraordinary book, The Idea of Australia, A Search for the Soul of the Nation, which I've had the pleasure to read over this last week. Also, we have Mary Crooks. So Mary is the Executive Director of the Victorian Women's Trust. She is the one that designed the original kitchen table conversation process and has led many groundbreaking community engagement initiatives, such as the Purple Sage Project and Our Watermark Australia. So welcome and thank you, Julianne and Mary. So I'm going to start the Zoom session tonight having a chat to Julianne, who's going to set the context for then us talking about the Together Yes process. So Julianne, lovely to have you here. As I said, I read your book over the last week, having ordered a copy from Melbourne, and I've really enjoyed delving into it. For people who don't have access to the book, then I suggest that you read Julianne's article that's been published by the Australian Academy of Humanities, which the link to will be put in the chat facility. So, Julianne, to you. One of the many things struck me in your book, and I thought there's so much I could talk to you about, but we have such limited time. So I've tried to hone in on the things that I think will be really important to people. Mm-hmm. So I learned a lot, and I'm quite astounded by how much I didn't know. So let's start with the past. You write that the failure to recognise those who made this continent home for millennia has taken many forms, but the refusal to formally recognise has been constant. Most of us have little knowledge of the long, persistent, unanswered call from First Nations people for formal recognition. So firstly, can you give us some understanding of how we've come to this point in 2023?
Sure, Alana, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm in Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales. Look, it's as long as European settlement, really, the quest for recognition by First Nations people, and that we don't know much about it, that most of us don't know much about it, is, I think, part of the sort of general whitewashing of history that's gone on in this country, you know, again, since those first fleets, people arrived in 1788. If you follow the line through, you can see that there has been a really concerted effort by Aboriginal people to be recognised, as well as trying to maintain ownership and control of their own land. So it's not just the recognition wasn't just to sort of recognise us and that's okay, but there's really been a very dynamic sort of appeals that have been made repeatedly over this time. I guess that when you first start to see the sort of formal process of it in Tasmania, where people there, the people who survived the Black Wars, made a formal petition to Queen Victoria for recognition and for better conditions. That happened again in Victoria, again in the mid 19th century. So it started a pattern whereby people were seeking recognition from the Crown, as it was, from Queen Victoria and then subsequently.
I'm scared I'll hit the leave if I do this.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm getting some funny feedback. So that was in the 19th century. By the 20th century, after Federation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that process of Federation and rendering Aboriginal people invisible. But by not long after Federation, or actually immediately after Federation, there was legislation that was passed within the first Parliament, which was really about voting rights. And at that point, some strange feedback. At that point, there was arguments made in the Parliament that the recognition of Aboriginal people should exist because they were there first, and to not recognise them would be a travesty. The rejoinder was, well, what sort of point would it be to give them recognition when we've taken their land and rendered them into such a terrible situation? So that prevailed. But in the 19 within the next couple of decades, you have people like David Uniapan making a plea for a separate homeland, for an Aboriginal homeland that could be separate from the rest of the country. Everyone's probably pretty familiar with the Day of Mourning and that process in the 1930s to around the time of the centenary of settlement was being marked. There were then petitions again to the Parliament, again to go to the House of Commons, which were again rejected by the Australian Parliament. And then you move forward into the Yirrkala petitions from Northern Territory after the government made a mission into a mine, essentially, and the elders of the Yolngu people petitioned to the Parliament. That started a process of very extensive legal action. But again, there's this constant thing of saying, we were here, we existed, you need to recognise that. And through legal means, political means, every twist along the way, those approaches were rebuffed. And so you come to the current situation where, after the abolition of ATSEC, there was a clear recognition on all sides of Parliament, really, various times, that there needed to be a formal process of recognition. That it wasn't sufficient for the Parliament to enable the creation of bodies which could then be dismantled. And so the process of constitutional recognition again started up. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things in there as well. I mean, there were attempts at treaties and all the rest of it. So that process of recognition again started up. And the group of people who were brought together to consider what a change to the Constitution might look like, had some quite particular ideas of what shape that might take. But when the Indigenous leadership took that out in really what was a very considered form of deliberative democracy, consulting with Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait Islander communities around the country, that's how the process of the Uluru Statement emerged, and its three claims of voice, treaty, and truth-telling. Now, the thing that's sort of really, one of the things that's really important about that is that the outcome that came through that process wasn't necessarily what the people who were conducting the constitutional reform reviews in Canberra had in mind at all. They had to listen. They had to hear what was being said, and what they came back with was something else. But at its core is this not a plea. It's couched as a plea to the Australian people, but it's really something which has been a recurring failure in the polity of this nation.
Yep. So, Julianne, in linking that idea that you shared with us about this continuing call for recognition and how unanswered it's been, I'd like to link that to your idea of Australia, as you call it. I was very interested to read in your book that as early as 1803, Jeremy Bentham, who's a British philosopher and jurist, said that the failure to reach agreement with First Australians was an incurable flaw. So you talk about this continued failure as eroding our nation's foundations and constraining the actual idea of Australia. So can you explain to us
Yeah.
what you mean by this idea of Australia and why you're so sort of taken by this current campaign slogan, history is calling,
Sure.
and why you find that so inspiring?
Yeah, okay. And everyone who's just watched that video can get a sense of why that's such an inspiring sort of approach to this issue. I mean, at its simplest, it gives us all an opportunity to have a place in history in actually addressing a wrong which has not been addressed for 2 centuries. But also, I think, and in some ways possibly as importantly, it gives us an opportunity to learn more about our history, to learn more about what's gone on in the past, where the inflection points have occurred and where the decisions have been made that actually have led us to where we are now. And so that's not an opportunity that we often get. I mean, Australians are not particularly comfortable talking about their history. I mean, it became for a time quite highly politicised. And so there's a sort of caution and nervousness about it. But there's a wonderful history and the whole series of, there's bad history and there's good history. There's good things that happened as well as bad things that happened. But if we don't know about that, we can't imagine the future. And so one of the things that I think is so important about this process is that it gives us an opportunity to learn a bit more about what went on in the past. I mean, I gave a bit of a garbled explanation of some of those recognition pleas over the years, but there's, in all of those, there are great stories of heroic people, and many of them supported by non-indigenous people who were actually in there supporting them. It wasn't as though it was just respectfully listening, but actually there were activists right from the beginning actually taking the case and being supportive of it. The Bentham line is interesting because it was a sort of throwaway in his big essay because he disputed the way in which the colony of New South Wales was founded. And he's got this throwaway line that really the failure to recognise to reach an agreement with First Peoples would be an incurable flaw. Now, he was no particular advocate of Aboriginal people, and in fact he blamed Bennelong for not getting a treaty, coming to London with a treaty that the King could sign. Well, Bennelong and his colleague went to England, with Governor Phillip at the end of his term. Phillip kitted them out in the best possible clothes or appropriate for meeting the King. And the King made it clear that he didn't actually want to meet them. And that was there's a whole sort of argument about why that happened. But up until that point, whenever exotics had come from the colonies, the King of the day would make a point of meeting them. Now, that's a really fraught sort of area in and of itself. But what was interesting in the foundation of the colonies in Australia was that despite international law, which argued that, and was widely accepted, that conquering countries should form a treaty relationship with the people who were there first, that didn't happen on this continent. And at the same time, it had happened all around the world and continued to happen all around the world. So Australia was a bit of an outlier. It was a significant outlier in all of that. So I think that when you ask about the idea of Australia and why I sort of describe it as a half-formed thing, I think that if we can't get that bit right, all the other myths and stories and things we like to tell ourselves, and that they have been achieved remarkably in this continent over the last little while, it's as though the thing that's at its foundation has not been addressed. Rachel Perkins put it beautifully at the 2020 summit many years ago now, when she said the thing that made Australia truly unique was that continuous history of cultural and settlement through 60,000 years, or whatever we're going to find the number is. That's remarkable, and that's something that we need to embrace to really say this is what this nation is now. It can incorporate that as well as everything else.
Yeah. So in terms of understanding our history, in reading your book, I was very astounded when I read about Billy Hughes at the inauguration of Canberra in 1913, when in his speech he actually said that Australia was unfolding without the slightest trace of that race we have banished from the face of the earth. Like those words, banished, vanquished, they're such challenging and painful notions, aren't they?
Oh, shocking. Yeah.
And you talk about how purposeful scaffold of silence was erected to perpetrate this myth of Aboriginal people not being here. And we've been shaped by the silence as much as we've been shaped by the stories we have about Australia. So can you talk to us about silence and why this notion of the voice is so important?
Look, the silence is one of the great tools of control that have operated in Australia. I mean, by federation, the majority of Australians, I mean, the debates around race more generally were vitriolic and by today's standard just unconscionable to read. You know, as some judges have said, we're lucky that they didn't write that more fully. The White Australia policy wasn't written more fully into the Constitution. But what was written into the Constitution was a making of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or Aboriginal people at the time just invisible. People were prepared to convince themselves, even though the frontier wars were still going, you know, at the same time as the Federation debates were happening, the frontier wars were alive, you know, in the 50 or so years that Queensland was a colony. So during that period when the whole Federation question was being debated, at least 65,000 Aboriginal people were killed during those incursions by the native police. That's an enormous number of people. And so towards the end of that 19th century, what we found was that, you know, preachers and well-meaning people felt that to save the remaining Aboriginal people, they needed to be put into protective regimes. And the protective regimes were missions, but basically they were like prisons. I mean, you know, they were treated atrociously. There was never enough food. It was just, you know, an incarceration system done in the name of protection. While sitting on top of that was this notion that this was a dying race, that somehow it just miraculously just died out. You know, it wasn't anything due to active intent by the process of settlement. So when Hughes at the inauguration of Canberra talks about, you know, that we wipe these people from the face of the earth, you know, that would have at that time, I mean, there was people knew better. You know, there were books written, there were newspaper articles, you know, people knew what was actually going on. But the sort of convenient fiction that they would somehow just die out was absolutely widely held. And so this sort of silence that surrounded that and grew, it's interesting that the silence sort of grew. So famously in 1967, 68, when W.H. Stanner did the Boyer lectures, he talked about the tyranny of silence in Australia and how things couldn't be spoken out loud. He thought at that point, because there'd been a big inquiry into the Coniston massacre, that this might have been a period when things were starting to turn around, but he wasn't super hopeful. So to my mind, I think it's partly that it's not that for many people who've lived in this country for generations, there is a sense of sort of unacknowledged shame about what went on, and it's painful to talk about. It's painful to face up to and to realise the horror of the process of settlement. But unless we do, we can't actually move forward. We can't make proper restitution. We can't deal honestly and frankly with the First Australians or the First Nations people. So the voice, when you talk about the voice, I mean, the voice is inspired in that sense because a voice is something that needs to be listened to. And in a country where silence gets is held onto so tightly, a voice is something that needs to be paid attention to. You've got to hear as well as speak. And so that's why it's such an inspired sort of way of framing it, because if there is a voice, you've got to listen. And if you listen, you've got to think. And if you think, you've got to act. And that's its power.
Yep. And just finally, before we finish our short time, Julianne, but we'll come back for questions later, just a quick comment on the link you make between the silence and now this notion that, you know, stories form our nation, and that really part of what we're dealing with in this referendum is what Noel Pearson referred to as stories of deeply held old race memory that sort of categorise First Nations people in the minds of people and locked in a certain framework, and that that's going to resonate if we don't challenge some of those stories. A brief comment about that.
Yeah. Look, one of the things that Noel said in his Boyer lectures, he said that he talked about Aboriginal people as being the most despised people in Australia. And, you know, you'd argue it, but actually, you know, when you look at the history, that's true. And I think that what's happened now, I mean, I think people are really, you know, that there is an openness and a willingness to actually treat First Nations people respectfully, to hear what they're saying, to treat them with dignity and respect. But still we're talking about a split which is 97%, 3%. And the fact is that most Australians, I would think, have had very little contact with Aboriginal people. They may have in recent times become fans of the superstars, you know, the great sporting stars, the great singers, the great actors, the great artists, you know, the people who have really playing cultural leadership in the country. That's a point of contact. And, you know, there are other incidental points of contact, but it's very difficult, I think, for a lot of people who haven't had that sort of personal exchange to actually throw off those old race memories that Noel refers to. And that's why it's important to actually, you know, both inform, you know, bring more information to it. I mean, to, you know, an understanding of the sort of process of intergenerational trauma, which is on people's mind as we acknowledge the Sorry Day today, is really important. But it's also really important when you think about the sorry, you know, the apology that Rudd made, which was tremendously important. But that was in 2008. You know, the Bringing Them Home report had been tabled in 1997, and then Howard had refused to have anything, you know, to say you're guilty, so we don't need to apologise. I mean, there are a whole lot of other recommendations in that report as well, in terms of reparation and holding of stories, and psychological support and all sorts of things, all of which sort of got swept aside in the sort of the importance of saying sorry, but not going back into the detail. So I think that that's what this year, you know, is going to provide people all over the country with opportunities to meet with people in their local areas, to actually hear those stories, to learn some of the past, to learn of the good and the bad of what's gone on, so that they're actually in a position to make an informed decision. It's not just something that happens in Parliament on the screen or whatever. It's actually alive for everyone, wherever you happen to live.
Yeah. Well, there is so much we could talk about, Julianne, and I can only say to people to read the article that's the half-formed idea about Australia, to learn more, and we can learn so much from you. And I'm going to enjoy passing your book around in my network and talking about it with people as the year follows through. We'll come back to you with questions in a minute, but let's bring Mary into the conversation now. So welcome, Mary Crooks.
Thanks, Alana.
So while I was reading Julianne's book, which I know you have also read, she writes about Dadiri. So the notion of the respectful listening, talking and contemplation to inform action, where the I's come to be we's. Anyway, she quotes Miriam Rose, whom many of us may be familiar with, the renowned Aboriginal artist and educator, who was our 2021 Senior Australian of the Year. And she talks about Dadari being an Aboriginal gift to the nation, one that we've all been waiting for, the gift of listening. So reading that, I'm sure for you and me, resonated so much with what the Victorian Women's Trust has been talking about for more than a decade now. So you embedded this notion of like deep listening when you first designed the kitchen table conversation model some 20 years ago. And you designed it as a process to trigger reflection, contemplation, realisation and learning. And you say that via this type of conversation, people actually reframe their thinking. So can you explain what's the uniqueness of this approach that has the ability to bring people to a place of reframing their thinking?
Thanks, Alana. And I can say that I'm on Wurundjeri land, and I think perhaps like Julianne, after reading her book, that we both actually grew up on Gunditjmara land in southwestern Victoria.
As I did.
As you did.
Something in the water.
Something in the water up there. So, Alana, thank you. And look, in some respects, and when I read that section in Julianne's book with the work of Miriam and also Judy Atkinson, who did a lot of development around the idea too, you know, it's quite humbling in a way, because I've never thought that we were doing anything at the Women's Trust some 20 years ago, anything that was you know, entirely innovative, because people for time immemorial, and in particular in Indigenous society in this country, have been coming together, yarning, coming together in exchange, coming together in peaceable exchange for millennia. So it's not as though we invented something important here, but I think we did take an idea at a time of crisis in Victoria when people were hemorrhaging about what was happening around them. And we took this idea of bringing people together, of having serious dialogue with one another, of supporting their listening and their learning, of creating safe spaces where people wouldn't be shot down, you know, by people in the media or by politicians, but where people could gather around, have a shared safe space, but not simply sit around yarning about any old thing in a kind of kitchen table light way, but actually having a really considered, thoughtful, contemplative discussion, one with the other. So the values, I think, that are critical here separate out the kitchen table process from a lot of other activist tools even. The inclusivity, the shared safe space, the respectful thinking, even in the face of dissent, the ability to stop and reflect and listen and be prepared to learn from one another and be prepared to say, I never knew that, to expose the limits that there might have been to your learning. We had a fantastic experience with that with our watermark some 18 years ago. And one of the most frequent bits of feedback after that process was from people, both regional and urban, saying to us they had so many, if you like, aha moments, where in response to the materials that we produced, they actually saw things differently. They were prepared to reframe their understanding because they were prepared to have their opinion tested in a semi-private forum. This is the power of the process, I think, that you go in with an open mind, you take your best side to the table, you go in with a constructive spirit, and you see what happens. You see what comes out in the wash. Uniformly, from my experience, this kind of discussion, properly supported and with good curated material, changes people for the better, changes people, shifts the needle in terms of their understanding of issues and their clarity in terms of what kind of action they might take into the future.
Yeah. So as I know, Mary, and many people would, that the kitchen table conversation process is not just people getting together for a chat or a conversation. And unfortunately, there's been many people who've misunderstood that, and you hear it used loosely all over the place now. The work that you've done to do many alliterations of the kitchen table conversation model to suit different contexts has now come to the point where you made a decision that it would also be a useful process for this nation in being able to address the issue of supporting a yes vote in this referendum. So you've now come up with this notion of Together Yes, and a model that communities can use with curated information specifically to us. So give us a bit of an understanding of what Together Yes looks like and how it's going to work.
Alana, when Prime Minister Albanese on the night of his election pledged that his government would implement the Uluru Statement in full, and I might come back to that later, But when he pledged a referendum on the voice, I think, to be honest, I would have been quite heartbroken if the Women's Trust, if we had not been prepared to put our shoulders to the wheel and create this nationwide kitchen table movement to support a yes vote. So thankfully, you in your role as the chair and the other board members and staff were aching with the same kind of desire. So from about last September onwards, we had wonderful close collaboration with Indigenous leaders to gain their confidence and imprimatur. And we've been busy designing the process. We've never rolled out a process on a nationwide scale before, but with the right planning framework and the right intent and the right set of skills, there's nothing to stop us from seeing this become a totally unprecedented movement around the country. And one of the important things about our desire to have this kitchen table model as a really primary driving campaign is that it has the potential to be a very significant counter to the vitriol and the negativity, the noise, and dare I say it, the racism that has already started to emerge through media commentary and across social media. So I think that we can act as a very important foil. Someone's asked a question straight away, and I'd like to answer it, Alana, in terms of the groups we have sought an imprimatur from. We've been very closely involved with From the Heart. We've been working with them on a weekly basis since November, and we've had some wonderful dialogue with Indigenous female leaders that, you know, I still marvel at the wisdom and the tenacity and the resilience. You know, women, iconic in my view, women like Megan Davis, Pat Anderson, Marcia Langton, Lowitja O'Donoghue, Jackie Huggins. I mean, these are exemplary leaders, and we've been able to feel quite humble and privileged actually to take up the invitation, which is to all Australians. It's not to politicians in the Uluru Statement. The Uluru Statement invites us to leave base camp with Indigenous people and start the trek and go on a journey together to a better world. So it's a great position, I think, for all of us to consider taking up that generous invitation.
Yeah. So, Mary, tell us about the process then for people who are interested in becoming part of the Together Yes movement.
So before Christmas, Alana, we were really busy. We'd engaged web designers. We had the micro designing just about done. We've got a wonderful team of volunteers who had been putting in the hard yards. And I sensed from moving around the community that there was quite a bit of incipient despair and frustration, that it seemed as though nothing was happening and that people were only hearing the awful stuff and what I call the willful confusion. So we decided to establish a landing page just before Christmas, simply to signal to people that opportunities were coming and to hang in there, hold tight, because, you know, Christmas was getting in the way, people on holidays, and besides which the Yes campaign properly is only going to be launched next week in Adelaide. So we launched a landing page. We have had hundreds of people register already to be conversation hosts who play the pivotal role in establishing this movement around the country. Our website is almost completed and will go live next week. Thereafter, we spend 2 months, March and April, enlisting conversation hosts all around the country through a variety of quite aggressive strategies of recruitment. Corporates, businesses, NGOs, faith communities, multicultural communities, you name it. We've got a series of community information sessions around the country, starting in March and April. The formal conversations will be held in May and June. And, you know, I've been saying to people, don't feel as though that's too late. It's not too late in the process. It's actually a good time in the process because people will have seen a lot of the noise. They will have heard a lot of the arguments, and now's the time in May to sit down together with people and have a considered, thoughtful canvassing of the issues and do it together and build the kind of solidarity that we need around the country. And interestingly, Alana, the other reason for starting the conversations all together rather than in a staggered fashion is the immense solidarity that Australians can gain from knowing that in that month of May, thousands and thousands of people are sitting down together and having a respectful, considered, thoughtful and deep conversation about the issues. May happens to coincide with two glorious anniversaries. May is the anniversary of the 1967 referendum, the last chance Australians had to vote on constitutional change affecting Aboriginal people. And May is also the anniversary of the Uluru Statement from the Heart itself. So we see a great symbolism in starting our conversations around the voice in May. And so that's it in short, the timetable. We've got the next 2 months, we're preparing the curated materials. And I was interested in Julianne's reference to the chronology of intercession, the chronology of people going in deputations and with petitions, pleading to be heard, to be listened to, and to be having some role in the governance of this country. So we will take up that kind of issue and explore that in more detail. For example, there will be a lot of learning and there will be many, many people around the country, I predict, saying, I never knew that. Gosh, I never knew that.
Yeah.
And that's one of the best outcomes we can look for, because that shows people are starting to think and being open to change.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mary, just quickly, a couple of quick questions before we go to the broader questions. There's been so many people of goodwill in communities already planning activities and doing things in their communities. But as we all know, it's really hard to reach beyond the people who are already thinking the same way you are.
Sure.
You know, we can hold picnics and all sorts of things for people to come to, information sessions, and the people who come are the people who are supportive. So the kitchen table conversation is a pathway to reach out further than that, to those people who don't actually either understand or know about the voice or made up their mind. So just tell us a little bit about why creating that pathway through kitchen table conversations can be so powerful.
Yeah, and Alana, even way back in Purple Sage Days and Watermark, not surprisingly perhaps, but the overwhelming majority of conversation hosts were women. And the beauty of it is that they then bring others into the process. They brought either their husbands or their uncles or their sons, the next door neighbours, people from their faith communities. So they actually reached out and brought people into the process in a welcoming and inclusive kind of way. The other thing that's interesting way back in Purple Sage Days is that we asked our conversation hosts to be able to speak English so that we could communicate with with materials and so on. But we said, as long as we can talk to you, because we can't afford multiple translations and whatever, but you can in fact hold the conversations in the language of your choice. And way back then, 20 years ago, something like the Purple Sage conversation groups were conducted in about 40 community languages, and we'll be doing the same this time around. I think people need to be mindful. I've had lots of debates with friends recently, some saying, oh, everybody supports the voice. And I say, no, it's not a shoo-in. And it's so important that even if we agree at the moment about voting yes, we can't take it for granted. And even if the referendum result managed to squeeze in, that messages Indigenous people in this country that some 3 or 4 Australians out of 10 didn't want them to have a voice. And my other salutary warning to people is that my understanding is that with the marriage equality debate, over the course of a fairly toxic campaign, the degree of community support for saying yes to marriage equality actually dropped some considerable points. So there's work to be done, Alana, and I think our kitchen table model has a powerful capacity to bring people in who might be semi-strangers to some people in the group. They're not necessarily all loving one another, but because it's safe and respectful, and because it's well moderated and the materials are thoughtfully curated, I think it does wonders to help people sort things out, other than other methods. But I would say that every campaign is legitimate, and every opportunity for people to talk to one another is to be encouraged. We're just intent on providing something that we think has the tremendous capacity to shift the dial in a lot of people's thinking over the next 8 months.
Yep, thanks, Mary. So in the little time that we have left, there's been people putting questions in. There's a couple of themes that really come very clearly through. So, Julianne, I'm going to pose this question to you, which is around, people are saying in the chat, Indigenous people who are against the voice. But I'm going to frame the question like this. So we talked about navigating the range of views within Indigenous communities about the voice and the referendum, and like how we do navigate that. And you talked about the core concept of recognition. So can you address that whole issue of people watching this range of opinions within Indigenous communities in Australia and how they're reading it?
Yeah. Look, I think that the key thing is that this all happens respectfully, that there will, of course, be different points of view, and people need to make up their own minds. I mean, it seems to me that one of the things that is happening a little bit on the ground at the moment is that people are hearing the range of different points of view from Indigenous people, and then throwing up their hands and saying, oh, I can't make a decision about this. They can't all decide. Therefore, oh gosh, I just want to wash my hands and we'll just leave things as they are. Now, that's actually not an option that we've got at this stage. Well, what we've got at this stage is a proposition that's being put after decades of considered work by a large number of people to come up with a proposition. Now, the proposition is as we are hearing it, that it's a voice, an elected voice to provide input to the federal parliament and to the executive government. That's the proposition that's on the table. Now, we don't, and I think this is important, we don't know exactly what shape that is going to take. We don't know exactly the form it's going to take because it's something that will evolve. And it will evolve in response to Parliament and to negotiation and co-design and all the other bits and pieces. But all we are being asked to do at this stage is to either accept the proposition that is being put to us through this very long and deliberative process, knowing that what comes out of it will evolve over time. Necessarily it will evolve. And I mean, the people who are, for instance, there are people who are arguing that this won't solve the problems on the ground. Well, actually, we don't know. We do know that the models that have been working, that we've had for a long time, ever since the sort of protection days of the missions, haven't worked. We know that hasn't happened, hasn't worked. So there is a proposition which may work and will be diligently followed. The other group, I think, that's raising the argument in terms of sovereignty and treaty, who are wanting to see the treaty process commence first. There's been a long history of this in Australia. I mean, Bob Hawke in 1983, when he was elected, promised land rights, and a few years later promised treaty, and then not long after that broke down in tears and said, I can't do it. The problem with that is that there's not a treaty on the table. What there is on the table is a proposition for us to acknowledge the request that has been made for recognition and to start a process, knowing that process will necessarily evolve. And if we can be respectful about it, I'm sure that the issues of treaty and Makarrata and of truth-telling will come out of it, because they must. It's inevitable. It's just timing.
Thanks, Julianne. And I will just switch over to Mary to follow that up a little bit, because quite a lot of the the conversation on the chat has been around this whole notion about people who want treaty first, or is the voice a step towards treaty? So just in ending, can you remind us about Makarrata, and can you remind us about how all this fits together and what we're being invited to do?
I think I'm a bit curious when people do say, look, you know, some Indigenous people are opposed to the voice, which would seem to imply that Australian white society is totally consensual when it comes to voting in elections. When in fact we split the vote between 30% and, you know, another 20 to 30% or so. I feel very strongly about this in that I have studied closely the work of, not just read the Uluru Statement, but I have studied clearly and closely the process that has been followed in the leading up to the National Convention, and then from which the Uluru Statement was penned. I'm in awe of the kind of regional dialogue methodology that was entirely Indigenous-led and designed, which, for example, that the record of meetings of each regional dialogue was not read out or shared with any other regional dialogue, so that the cultural authority of the group itself was respected. And I pitch my tent, frankly, with the Indigenous leadership in this country who worked their butts off over those years, over many decades, but over the years leading up to the convention, and this solid agreement coming through the National Convention and the Uluru Statement is for voice, treaty and truth. And the support for the voice was overwhelming. And the fact that 7 delegates might have walked away from the Uluru Statement from the Heart Gathering is not enough evidence, in my view, to somehow denigrate the efforts of the majority of people. Makarrata is a powerful, to me, goosebumpy term. Makarrata is in the Uluru Statement. It's an Indigenous word that signals the coming together after a conflict, coming together after a struggle. And so Makarrata is in the Uluru Statement, says we have a voice. When we get a voice, then we work for Makarrata because it's about treaty and truth-telling. And I think we have the chance, not just in 2023, we have the chance of a decade now, in our lifetime, the chance of a decade to hold government to account for implementing Uluru in full. That means voice in 2023. And through our learning processes of the voice, we set ourselves up to be much more receptive and understanding about the need for treaty and the need for truth-telling.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much more that we can talk about, and the team at CIP had a lot of conversation as to how we would structure tonight, because there is so much that people want to know, and it wasn't going to be our purpose to actually put forth arguments for the yes vote or try and explain everything to everyone. And it certainly wasn't our intention to put any onus on Indigenous people to convince us to vote yes. Mary Crooks has often said that what happens this year and what happens with this referendum is going to be down to what non-Indigenous people say and do. And so when you look at Julianne and Mary, just 2 of the leaders who are stepping forward and really bringing things to the front so that we can all engage in a stronger way and accept that invitation from the heart to join with Indigenous people. The process of the Together Yes model provides a pathway for us. And as Mary said, there's going to be lots of other activity. And I just feel that we're getting a foundation that hopefully we're all going to spring forth from and become the activists in our communities to actually take this responsibility of non-Indigenous people to the people in our communities and say it's up to us to step up and step forward now. So it's really a very exciting opportunity to participate in history, as Mary said. And it's possible for all of us because this model makes it possible. So I want to thank you both so much for the work you're doing and also for joining us tonight and making this Zoom session possible. And hopefully lots of people will go and to the Together Yes website and understand more about it and read Julianne's work. So again, thank you so much. And Tina, I'm going to hand it back to you to tell people what we've got planned for 2023 beyond tonight's session.
You're on mute, Tina.
Thank you. And thanks, Alana, and an enormous thanks to you, Mary and Julianne, for that inspiring and insightful discussion. And I know I've seen in the chat, when is the recording going to be available? We will have that for everyone that's registered, and it'll also be on our website. A very quick update about the Community Independence Project and what's coming up. And when we talk about the project, we're talking about everyone involved in the community independence movement. And we're bringing communities together to conduct successful campaigns to get more communities elected and to build participatory democracy across the nation. In other words, we're working to put community at the centre of politics. But this year, our focus is on community building, and we're all working together, learning from each other, paying it forward. And to facilitate that, we've planned a monthly Zoom program, our annual convention. We're going to have masterclasses, there'll be networking, mentoring, and the sharing of contacts and resources. And if you haven't already, please be sure you've signed up to our newsletter and follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram for our latest news and updates. And please join us next time for our Zoom on Thursday, the 16th of March, which is going to be about disinformation. And we have Zali Stegel, independent member for Warringah, and Ed Coper, the author of Facts and Other Lies. And they're going to be talking about disinformation and its threat to democracy. They'll explore how we can stop the lies, diffuse and inoculate against disinformation. And this Zoom has particular relevance for our discussion tonight and for the Voice referendum, because already we're seeing so much misinformation and disinformation. So please save that date, 16th of March. And thank you all for being part of the Community Independence Project. It's your project, and we'll keep making history together. And last year, we changed politics forever, and this year, history is calling us again. And this time we're being asked to give First Nations people constitutional recognition and a voice to Parliament. So let's answer that call. Let's all make this a priority in our lives and be proactive in our communities. It'll only happen through our actions, through community being the drivers and the activators. So please do sign up for the Yes Together conversation to be a host, and I can see lots of people are saying that they would do that. So we'd love you to stay on for the networking session, which is going to be run by Michelle, where everyone can get a chance to chat about how they're going to answer the call and what they plan to do. So we look forward to seeing you at the next Zoom, hopefully on the 16th of March. And Michelle, I'll hand over to you.